I'm Darlene Hedstrom from Wittenberg University in Springfield, Ohio, and I'm going to be speaking on From Egypt, the Monastic Landscape, Writing a New History of Egyptian Monastic Site Formation. Egypt holds a unique place in the religious imagination of Christians from the late antique and medieval Mediterranean world. It is the land of ascetic forerunners like Anthony and Evagrius and Pachomius. Visitors such as John Cassian, Egeria, and Palladius recorded their visits to the Desert Fathers and Mothers and offered for their readers a world of miraculous ascetic achievements and practical tips for how to carry out the business of ascetic living. As the legacy of the Egyptian desert moved through the recitation of sayings and reported visits to Egyptian monks, a story emerged of monastic origins that offered a neat and tidy story of two paths, one of communal living espoused by Pachomius, and one of isolation and privacy espoused by Anthony. As the narrative gained popularity, the Egyptian desert became a canvas onto which well-known Egyptian monks battled demons, healed visitors, and lived long lives surviving on a loaf of bread and a little water. My objective this afternoon is to offer an alternative reading of the monastic settlements by looking at the late antique landscape from the vantage point of the Nile. By starting our view of the Nile from the river in the floodplain, the most commonly used form of transportation in Egypt, I assert that our notion of the remoteness and separateness of monastic settlements becomes difficult to maintain. As part of a larger project examining the construction of monastic landscape and the spatial configuration of the built environment, my discussion today explores specifically the physicality of monastic site formation, the Egyptian landscape, and the decisions of monastic builders in response to reclaiming the desertscape. And using theoretical models from cultural geography, historical ecology, and the phenomenology of landscape, I will illustrate the value of shifting our perspective to see how Egyptian monastics settled in a landscape closely associated to existing communities. Narratives of relocation and settlement figure prominently in the hagiographies and other forms of monastic literature from the Eastern Mediterranean. The stories present carefully constructed accounts explaining why the founder of a community, such as Moses the Black, moved to Wadi Natrun and what incidents propelled his desire to seek out a desert place. But are these stories reliable historical accounts? Despite efforts to examine the redaction of the sayings of the Desert Fathers in earlier generations for the kernels of historical events, most scholars are convinced that we can find little of the Desert Fathers of history. In many cases, we do not have the foundation accounts for the numerous small monastic settlements that dot the landscape. Certainly, those living in remote areas are extremely difficult to reconstruct except from passing references. In looking at the foundation narratives, we learn how monks were taught to regard the environment, their participation in a legacy of their founder, and the importance of God as a navigator to suitable locations for monastic living. Visual representations of monastic settlements are sparse, with the majority of spatial representations fixated on the external and internal of church spaces. Wall paintings from monastic sites, wooden lintels, portable icons, and painted pottery provide only scant indications of any geographical space or emplacement of buildings in a landscape to assist us in interpreting the highly idealized image of the built environment in literary sources. The monk and the monastery, therefore, are not grafted into an actualized landscape that is reproduced visually for consumption and replication by the community, and it is not available to us as modern interpreters of the past. We must therefore turn to the archaeological evidence of monastic settlements to begin reconstructing where monks lived. The shift in settlement patterns in late antique Egypt comes with the advent of monasticism and new building projects in areas not previously used for long-term domestic habitation in the past. Monastics built many new settlements, such as the monastery of Epiphanius in Thebes, by converting unused caves and tombs and temporary shelters of those who once lived on the fringes. Grave diggers, soldiers, traders, quarrymen, and miners frequently found themselves sheltered in temporary dwellings during their work projects. Monks modified these long-abandoned shelters and reoccupied abandoned buildings and villages as a process of new site formations. Most monastic communities participated in creating new sites alongside previously existing ones. From the 5th to the 9th century, monks participated in a process of desert reclamation by electing to use areas on the borderline between the densely selected areas of the cultivated valley, associated floodplains, and the delta. Unlike other areas of the Eastern Mediterranean, Egypt does not have a periphery countryside per se. Hence, while other regions of the Eastern Mediterranean witnessed the development of rural and countryside monasticism, Egypt's topographical features created the conditions for a desert monasticism that was very near and visible to most non-monastic communities. In addition, because the Nile served as the main avenue for transportation, most travelers could see monastic settlements as the white limestone plastered walls appear highlighted against the desert's vertical cliffs. In some, the Nile, as Roger Bagnall succinctly phrases it, organized space. The organizational feature of the Nile and its associated floodplains extends to the sharply rising desert cliffs, which frame the Nile Valley, and the delta, whose many waterways created islands, marshes, and small desert areas, also provided networks of connectivity throughout the land. Just as in Egypt's earlier history, its riverine flooding in late antiquity had a significant impact on monastic settlements and spatial configurations. Communities responded to the annual flood by rebuilding and finding suitable housing depending upon the height of the flood. A map from 1883 outlines the dynamic nature of Egypt's floodplains and the relationship to site formation and preservation at the ancient capital of Memphis. Similarly, at Saqqara, it is clear that the inundation would inform site selection and decisions about where to build towns, and that would not need to be rebuilt or repaired on a regular basis. It is critical to remember that for several months each year, the Egyptian landscape changed dramatically, and we would be wise to consider how the reality may have informed permanent site selection by monastic communities. Egyptian settlements were usually placed upon higher mounds so that the settlement would not be flooded during the inundation period. In the south, near Aswan, the flood reached a height of 13 meters, and further north at Luxor, about 11 meters, and further north still at Cairo, the flood could be as high as 7 meters. The Nile, like many other major rivers, has shifted its position throughout time, and thus the mapping of those shifts also impacts how we understand site formation processes. The hazardous nature of the flood and the movement of Nilotic animals such as crocodiles into the settled landscape created many concerns for those living on the edges. Monks, sailors, merchants, and others adjusted their needs to travel to accommodate the changing landscape, as the water's edge was much closer than in the winter and spring months. The fact that many settlements were not on the edge of the river, but further inland and on the banks above the floodplain, means that several settlements were in fact further away from the Nile's edge and closer to the desert cliffs. Egypt's limestone and shale cliffs often abruptly rise from the agricultural basin and frame the Nile from Aswan in the south to the delta in the north. The contrast between the tan hills of the cliffs and the green agricultural fields in the valley below provides a visible boundary between the two areas, diminishing any transitional space for the two locations. The completion of the Aswan Dam and the use of modern hydraulic systems have permanently transformed Egypt's landscape so that we often forget how much the Nile consumed the floodplains for several months each year. It is important to remember that the percentage of arable land that has changed and altered the relative perceived distances between archaeological sites, the Nile, and the desert. The settlement patterns therefore developed in response to Egypt's unique topography and geophysical features, thus creating unique challenges and choices for Egyptian builders, including monks, who established new residences on the fringes of traditional village settlements. The monastic reclamation of the desert for habitation ushered in a new period of late antique expansion into areas previously unused and used not only for natural resources, burials, and temporary shelters. In most cases, only limited documentary evidence was found at the earlier encampments, perhaps reflecting the lower literacy rates of miners, watchmen, and quarrymen. With the movement of a more literate population into desert locations, the archaeological evidence for occupation seems to spike dramatically, with physical modifications to caves, quarries, and tombs. Although hagiographies might suggest otherwise, documentary evidence proves that monks were not economically, physically, or socially isolated from others. Their new residences therefore became places for more robust encounters between those who lived on the fringes and those who settled in the agricultural and urban districts. And while they may have been physically separated from their families, it does not appear that they were always emotionally or financially separated from them. The recovery of monastic archives attests that monks were heavily engaged in economic, legal, and social activities on behalf of the monasteries and themselves. Over 200 monastic sites survive in Egypt, including the Delta, the Oasis, and the Nile Valley. The size of settlements varies in density and in area, with some including only 2 dwellings and others as many as 1,500. 2/3 of monastic settlements were built entirely from the ground up. These purpose-built environments included private residences for smaller groups of monks, private kitchens, oratories, workrooms, and sometimes facilities for housing guests. At the monastery of John the Little in Wadi Natrun, the Yale Monastic Archaeology Project mapped over 80 monastic dwellings clustered around a central mound with a church. Our excavation of a 9th century monastic residence included 25 rooms, 3 private kitchens, and a wonderfully painted oratory, complete with stoops for sitting and adjoining sleeping quarters. Only 1/3 of monastic settlements are repurposed habitations of previously existing shelters, either natural formations or man-made, such as abandoned homes, tombs, and quarries. The use of tombs for monastic dwellings has generated some interest in how monastics viewed the ancient sacred landscape and whether it had spiritual power that monks sought to dominate. While discussions about death and pagan tombs or temples surface in monastic literature, they're not prevalent themes. The rarity of the references in light of the number of sites built around older pagan structures makes the anomalous occurrences all the more intriguing. Previous generations of Egyptologists and archaeologists viewed the tombs as clearly pagan spaces, gleefully defaced by monastic inhabitants. However, it is difficult to maintain that monks were so disturbed by the tombs and their pagan representations. There are cases of defacement at a variety of tombs, to be sure, but it is selective and not thorough. In many cases, tombs are altered by the application of white plaster, which in turn helps seal and protect the vibrant pharaonic colors beneath. And they did much, as evinced at Amarna, Beni Hassan, and elsewhere, to incorporate the exterior of the tomb's entrance for new buildings. If we consider the spatial proximity of the near desert, with its already pre-existing features, and the monastic belief that they were establishing a holy place, it seems very logical that monks elected to reclaim the desert and build structures that closely resembled those of the villages nearby. By doing so, they extended the boundaries of the cultivated and inhabited land further than it had been before. Aside from the fact that the desert makes up 90% of Egypt's natural landscape, the desert was a central component of ancient Egyptian and Christian theology. The nature of the desert as both a positive and negative space for spiritual encounters is rooted in ancient pharaonic thought. Before the introduction of Christianity, Egyptians conceived of the desert as both the realm of the evil gods, such as Set, but also as the realm of the sacred. The western bank of the Nile in particular was associated with the land of the deceased. Despite the fact that the desert was an important place in religious topography of ancient Egypt, sedentary populations throughout antiquity did not elect to inhabit the desertscape, but rather chose to live on the mounds above the floodplains near the desert's edge. A few individuals did reside in the desert, but this was linked more to their occupations within the desert as miners, tomb builders, soldiers on outposts, and caravan drivers. They lived in natural caves, older abandoned tombs, and even in the actual quarries that they were cutting just as long as the job required. The dangers of the desert were tied with the very physicality of the desertscape. It was radically different from the city or villages of the floodplains. The desert held endless sand, natural caves, mountains, ravines, man-made stone quarries, and tombs. And due to the number of activities that would bring laborers and soldiers into the escarpment and its wadis, the desert hosted numerous and frequent encounters between the world and monastic communities. Men bringing wine on camels, quarrymen going into the hills to extract stone, soldiers on military outposts, and visitors to holy places and holy people all found pathways leading to monastic-built environments that were very visible from the fields below. This was the outer desert, the area closest to the inhabited and agricultural lands. Beyond this area lay the inner desert. In order to find the monks living in these sites, one needed to literally journey into the deepest desert. The dwellings in the inner desert were not visible either from the escarpment or the terraced lands below, but were located along caravan, salt, and quarry routes. The men living in these spaces were much further removed from society, but they were the minority. Regardless of where monastics built their settlements, they used materials readily available. Mud was easily acquired from the cultivated areas of the Nile Valley where the floodplain distributes silt. Accounts of monks building a cell in a day were not necessarily untrue, as a dwelling can be constructed rather quickly with a wooden brick mold. Once the bricks were sufficiently dry, construction could begin, and in many cases a roof was not even necessary. Simply laying palm leaves over the room's opening would provide adequate shade and sufficient ventilation. But many monastic settlements were complex affairs, reflecting well-designed spatial configurations, attention to the environment, and a value for organized living. The process of monastic building, therefore, is not necessarily restricted to a particular class of skilled artisans, carpenters, or masons. This is also true for non-monastic buildings, which in the villages share many similarities with the monastic built forms. The intentionality of monastic construction to meet the needs of the resident and the challenges of the environment are apparent at several sites. Nakloun in the Fayoum is a fine example of site design in which monastics use the very contours of the cliffs to create spatial divisions within their large community. In terms of construction of the residences, these too show a sensitivity to the natural environment, as the rooms enhance morning and midday lighting by the placement of windows on the south side of the complex. Low afternoon indirect light is given to the dwelling areas on the north area of the complex as well as to the kitchens. Windows often align with ventilation shafts on opposite walls to allow for airflow through rooms, as seen also at the dwellings in Wadi Natrun and Akelia. The arid climate and the intensity of the heat in the summer months in Egypt required dwellings to have thick walls to retain the cool of the desert evenings. Similar features exist at the dwellings at Esna, much further south in Upper Egypt, in which the residences are carved down into the desert plain. Steeply sloping windowsills that extend almost to the floor provide the widest area for light to reflect down into the dwelling. At Esna, we see the use of short walls in front of doorways to prohibit wind-blown sand from entering into the rooms, and this feature is particularly important as the open courtyards are sunken into the desert floor, and thus the depressions would naturally accumulate significant amounts of drift sand, compared to those buildings that were built on level with the desert escarpment. While the majority of residences were made of mud brick, a few settlements, such as at Amarna, show the use of stone to secure particular architectural features and may, in some cases, illustrate the choices of available resources for building. Palladius tells us a story in which Dorotheus collected stones in the desert by the sea and made cells for those who could not build. Stone could be gathered from a variety of locations. At Amarna, many monks repurposed the tombs by building stone structures on the terraces extending from the tombs. Some stone could be gathered from existing pharaonic monuments as well. And an 8th century receipt from the monastery of Apa Apollo describes monastic supervision of the acquisition of stone. Documentary evidence such as this therefore helps us envision that the leaders of monastic communities were often overseers of building projects. Epigraphic evidence for building and builders at monastic sites also outlines who played a role in building monastic settlements. An inscription from 753 recounts how a layman gave a workshop to the monastery of St. Mary. He intended for the workshop to be used for monastic skilled crafts, and additional accounts of building are found in lintels in monastic and lay homes. Sometimes the inscriptions identify the inhabitants and whether or not they were the builders of the structure. At the monastery of Apo Apollo at Bawit and the monastery of Apo Jeremias at Saqqara, lintels provide information about the occupation or position of the monastic residents. In the Fayoum, 10th century lintels contain formulas in which the named builders all indicate that they have built their houses with their own hands. All who would enter the building would be reminded of the accomplishment of the masons, and thus the materials of the building would recreate a social reminder of the owner's occupation and skills. Attention to monastic builders, their buildings, and where they built will help us articulate a more nuanced history of monastic settlements. Earlier generations of archaeologists and historians found themselves transfixed by tombs and monumental temples, and rarely found mud brick settlements to be worthy of study. Discovering papyri, mummies, and textiles, for example, were much more satisfying than tracing the limits of mud brick settlements, even when built into temple complexes. Growing interest in household archaeology and the continued support for settlement and landscape archaeology makes it possible to look at monastic settlement with new eyes. The central difficulty that I and others have noted in plotting and tracing the settlements of late antique Egypt, as with earlier periods, is how much the Nile and its annual flood dictated where communities were built, and why we need to use diverse tools to relocate them. Given these challenges, we can, with the use of new technologies such as remote sensing and surface surveys and more critical readings of our sources with theoretical models, reconsider the monastic landscape with an eye to its antiquity. So rather than seeing mud brick structures blending into the desert and visually disappearing, we can appreciate the nearness of the monastic settlements. To talk about site formation processes for late antique monastic Egypt means we must begin with the Nile, look across the floodplains and cultivated fields to understand how the desert was the edge for everyone. Once we use this perspective, then we can begin to consider the interconnectivity of monastic settlements with their neighbors. Instead of retreating from the world, monastic communities were physically very much a part of the visible fabric of Egypt's late antique landscape.